everybody. However, we have an expert here from Eide Bailly. Eide Bailly has been a partner of ours for a good amount of years now, but this is the first time that I'm working with Christine, and I'm really excited to hear from her and to talk more about PPP loans. So with that, I'll turn it over to her and get out of her way.
Wonderful. All right, thank you, Evan. And you're able to hear me okay?
Yep, sounds good.
Perfect. Okay. So yes, kind of the main point of our presentation today is to run through the Paycheck Protection Program loans. And, we were asked here today by Evan just to kind of go over some of the legislative updates and really kind of take a little bit of time today to talk about PPP loans and how your organization can maximize forgiveness. So just a quick introduction. My name is Christine. I am located in Eide Bailly's Boise, Idaho office. Currently, I am coming to you live from sunny Meridian, as a lot of us kind of are at home and, working. So that's why my background's a little interesting today. I am a tax manager with our exempt organizations group. I work in the NTO, which is our National Tax Office. So I spend a lot of my time working in exempt organization and nonprofit compliance, a lot of tax work, a lot of kind of the regulatory pieces. And in this case, the firm kind of put together an SBA team for people to, work with the PPP loans and a lot of legislation related to the CARES Act. So here I am, I'm our nonprofit industry liaison for that piece. So as I mentioned, we're going to spend our time covering the Paycheck Protection Program, the loans, and we'll kind of go into just a brief overview of the PPP loan program for any kind of viewers today that maybe haven't applied yet. Then we'll talk about that application process quickly, and then we're going to spend most of our time discussing the new legislation that arrived earlier this month on June 5th. And then after that piece, walking through the legislation really covers a lot of the kind of the primary key concepts and how they changed. And so we'll kind of finish up with a discussion on how you can maximize your loan forgiveness, understanding those primary pieces, and how to essentially apply and complete that application for the loan forgiveness with your lender. If we have time, we can do some wrap up, we can do some questions. As Evan mentioned, please, put things into chat. She'll be monitoring that piece if you have questions as we go along. If not, my contact information is at the end of the presentation. So definitely feel free to reach out to me directly as well. So when talking about the PPP program, I think it's really helpful just to kind of step back and do this 10,000-foot view. And it's kind of a good comparison to, a couple years ago, we saw the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 come out. And, I remember a lot of people saying that this is the most broad reaching and comprehensive tax reform package we'd ever see in our lifetime, and that was many years in the making. And then here we've got this COVID-19 legislation, we've got the CARES Act, we've got two pieces of legislation passed specifically for the PPP loans, to enhance it and really add additional funding. And then also then on June 5th to expand and change some of these key provisions. It's all occurred within 3 months. So I think, there's been a lot of frustration when I've talked to people, that the guidance is being released in tiny pieces. If we go out and we look just at the Treasury, I was out there yesterday, I kind of consistently check it. There are 19 pieces of interim guidance. So it's been frustrating for, the borrowers, the organizations who are obtaining these loans, because it feels like things change, day to day. One day we'll have one piece of guidance or legislation, you know, the next week or the next month, you know, things will look differently, or we're thinking about things in a different way. So I think it's been kind of a frustrating process for people, but overall, you know, the PPP program really is designed to help organizations and to help them keep their employees. So, you know, this three months that we've kind of endured and gone through with this timeline, you know, hopefully these PPP loans are really going to help organizations in the long run. So just kind of with this overview, I just popped up a couple resources here. And, you know, these are really where if I'm trying to stay updated, these are the places I'm going to check. I'm going to go out to the SBA website. And thankfully, they've really done some great updates. I don't know if any of you saw it when they initially kind of released the PPP loans with the CARES Act. Their website left something to be desired. It wasn't good, it wasn't informative, but now it's really been updated. There's lots of information on who qualifies, that's easy to find, how to apply, copies of the applications. They've got links where you can see all of the lenders for each state. So there's a lot of information out there now on the SBA website, and I think it's much easier to navigate. For the Treasury, I typically check this first link, and it's, you know, if you just were to type Treasury PPP loan into Google, it's the first one that comes up. And this is nice because it's got, if you scroll down on the page, information for borrowers. So this is where I typically go in and link, and it has the PPP loan FAQs that are updated. And that one's nice because it's one document. So it's got all of the FAQs in one place, and I want to say it's over 17 pages now of questions, but that's a great resource. And then they've got all the interim guidance out there. And as I mentioned, the interim guidance is kind of interesting to look through because they have 19 pieces of legislation or guidance out there, and it all kind of goes to different points in time. So it's a little bit harder to look through unless you know specifically you know, where in the interim guidance you're looking, but it's a good resource. So kind of again at that 10,000 foot level, you know, the CARES Act, it put in place under Section 7A of the Small Business Act, the PPP, Paycheck Protection Program loans. And it allows them to be guaranteed by the SBA. It allows for forgiveness of the up to the full principal amount of the loan. You know, they were enacted to help businesses nationally, but really this main purpose, and this is what we always want to go back to, was it was to help businesses to retain workers and maintain payroll. You know, an interesting question I think that's been coming up recently is, you know, where we've been asked, you know, I've received a PPP loan, I'm not going to use it all for eligible expenditures, now what? You know, and I feel like people are maybe kind of fishing for, well, what if I save funds for a rainy day, or what if I don't use these for eligible expenditures? And, you know, kind of the response here is always, you know, what was the purpose of the PPP loan, or why did you obtain this? And so I always tell people, like, let's go back to, you know, this retaining workers and maintaining payroll and these eligible payroll and non-payroll costs, and, you know, trying to make sure people are utilizing the funds for these purposes. So for those who have maybe not applied yet or thinking about applying, the SBA has some good information out on who qualifies. And so for nonprofit organizations, you know, they did kind of limit our applicant pool. So 501c3 organizations, 501c19, veterans organizations, they opened it up and provided interim guidance. For religious organizations, and then certain hospitals. So in this case, you know, if you have a hospital entity that is not subject to, you know, your 990 filing requirements and is tax exempt under 115, that entity would be eligible so long as they can provide documentation that would support that they would otherwise be eligible and can meet the 501c3 requirements. So just kind of a brief overview. And so hopefully everyone attending today kind of fits in one of those categories. And then the PPP loans overall as a whole are, they're directed towards smaller organizations. So 500 fewer employees and or organizations that can meet the alternative SBA size standards or industry standards. So we can have organizations with greater than 500 employees that can apply and obtain these PPP loans subject to these alternative size standards. The amount of the loan, 2.5 times the 2019 average monthly payroll, up to 10 million. I don't think I've seen a nonprofit organization with 10 million yet here in Idaho. I'm sure somewhere across the United States there is one. Most of the organizations that I've worked with are typically in that maybe $70,000 to $200,000 range. That tends to cover a lot of the nonprofits, but I have worked with a lot of organizations, that have loan amounts here that are a couple $100,000, $1 to $2 million, and a few that are over that kind of $2 million threshold as well. So one item to note, if you have not yet applied and would like to, the deadline right now they kept as June 30th, 2020. However, it really should be stressed that this is the last day that the lender can obtain that SBA PPP loan number. So for anyone that still needs to apply, keep in mind that this is not the date that you can slide your paperwork across and apply for the PPP loan. You actually have to have everything in place and have the receipt of that PPP loan number by June 30th. I think a lot of the lenders are overwhelmed with this process. So if you are considering applying, it probably makes sense to do so sooner rather than later to make sure that you can work with the lender to get the application completed, to go through all of the lender's questions or, back and forth on determining the PPP loan maximum amount, and have the lender submit it for approval and obtain that loan number. And then kind of lastly on that note, the PPP loan, it does need to go through a lender. So either an existing SBA Section 7A lender or another participant that's federally insured, or one of these kind of noted institutions. So the SBA does provide these nice reports on their website. The most recent one was last Friday, and it's got some good, interesting information out there. And it tells you, who's getting the loans, but I like this one because it showed what the average size of the loan is, and it showed $112,000 as of last Friday. So, we are seeing these loan sizes all over the board, which I thought was pretty interesting. And then this was the available funding. As of last Friday, it showed almost $130 billion of funding was left. So if you need the PPP loan, if you were considering it, there's still time, there's still funds available. When I checked today, probably not as reputable sources showed about 126 billion was left. So some of the funds have disappeared over the last couple of days, but there's more than enough money to go around for those that need to apply. So in general, before we kind of start into the information about the new legislation, some primary provisions. As I mentioned, the PPP funds really are supposed to be utilized for employers and organizations to keep their employees employed, and to assist those organizations with continuing their operations. So that's kind of one bucket. And then also keep in mind that there's this eligibility based on payroll costs and non-payroll costs and the utilization of the funds. And then lastly, you can have the loan forgiven in whole or in part. And the loan repayment, it's favorable terms, 1%. It's really low financing, as I would say, for those who don't get the whole loan forgiven. I think when we look at the nonprofit industry or tax-exempt organizations, we're really hoping that most of these organizations can apply for and obtain that maximum forgiveness amount. So with that, we'll kind of jump into the new legislation. So this is the Paycheck Protection Program Flexibility Act of 2020. I don't want to say that 5 times fast because I trip on it saying it once, but that was enacted at the beginning of this month on June 5th. So this is really where we've seen quite a few changes. So everything that we learned almost over the last 2 months, you know, some of it we can just kind of throw right out the window. Some of it we're kind of building on those pieces. And as long as we've got the basics, we're okay. There are just a few new nuances. But it did materially change some of these key components that we've all read about in the PPP loan provisions and the act. So I've got a note here, it's generally retroactive. So this legislation that came out on the 5th, essentially we're taking it all the way back to the enactment of the CARES Act date, March 27th, and we're kind of applying it as if it's been in place the whole time. There are a couple of items in here that are specific to the June 5th date, and we'll highlight those as we go through. So the new legislation, kind of the first big piece here is the covered period. So the original statute or the original information in section 1102 of the CARES Act indicated, and our interim guidance told us we've got an 8-week covered period or 56 days to make our eligible expenditures. And additional interim guidance was released, and it indicated that our covered period or 8-week period begins as soon as you receive that disbursement of funds through our lender. So our new legislation that came out on the 5th indicates that that kind of automatic covered period is now going to go through 24 weeks after the origination or disbursement of this loan, or you can carry it through December 31st, 2020. So that 12/31/2020 kind of replace, it's the new June 30th for a lot of items. So this effectively extends this covered period. So we're going to 24 weeks instead of 8 weeks, 168 days instead of 56. However, our existing borrowers, so anyone who had a loan before June 5th, can choose between the 2 periods. So if you received your loan prior to June 5th, you can elect to utilize the 8-week covered period that was originally provided in the guidance. So 24 weeks is kind of automatic unless you elect to apply that original 8-week covered period. Now, with the 8-week covered period, one of the big items that they did clarify was we were looking at this $100,000 salary cap for our employees. So essentially what it was saying is over 8 weeks, the cash compensation cannot be more than $100,000 annualized, or over those 8 weeks, you cannot pick up more than $15,385 in cash compensation costs for an employee for PPP loan eligible expenditures. The limit is now 46,154 if you're going over the 24-week period. So they did just do the same calculation. Instead of 8/52 to get you to the 15,385, they're allowing you 24/52. So you can see when we expand out to the 24-week period, you can kind of pick up that same amount per employee just over the longer period of time. It allows you to pick up 46,154. And the note down the bottom, yes, this is just for salaries or that cash compensation piece that's limited to the $100,000 annualized cap. If you pay those non-cash benefits, so the health, the retirement, your state and local taxes, those are on top of these limits. So it's been a kind of an interesting decision because, you know, a lot of people over the last couple of weeks before this legislation came out were worried about paying out bonuses. There were questions about making special payroll to try to make sure that they got within the 8-week covered period. So all of a sudden we've got this 24-week period, and it kind of puts a different thought process or spin on it. You know, we've got a lot of organizations saying, well, I can probably meet that just by paying out my regular payroll now. So we've an example down here where it just essentially says, during the 8-week covered period, they had to do an extra bonus payment in order to meet the eligible expenditures for the PPP loan. Okay, now that we've got 24 weeks, we can easily generate our expenditures using payroll without making any additional payroll payments or bonuses, as you will. So here, with the new legislation, it's indicating, okay, well, now that we've extended it from 8 to 24 weeks, who's helped? Okay, well, people who just got their loans can now use 24 weeks. If you recently received your loan, so say you received it on June 1st, well, now you can decide, do I want to use 8 weeks or do I want to use 24? What's going to be more advantageous to my organization? Who's not helped? These borrowers or people who received their loans a while ago that are nearing the end of their 8 weeks that have spent their funds, this new legislation with the 24-week covered period, it doesn't necessarily help them unless you still have some extra funds that need to be spent. So we now have that choice between the 8-week and the 24-week covered period for our existing borrowers. And it's kind of been a conversation. So a lot of borrowers now are trying to think, what's going to make sense? Do I fit everything into the 8 weeks? Or do I lean towards the 24-week period? So why choose the 8-week period? The guidelines, the application have all been issued. Everything that we've seen so far has given us guidance on an 8-week period. So a lot of people are comfortable, they understand the 8-week covered period calculations and the reporting. If your organization has already expended all the funds or is close to in closing out the 8-week period, it probably makes sense if you can qualify for forgiveness on everything that's been spent in the 8 weeks to do so. If you can choose the 8-week covered period, it means that you don't have to wait. You can go ahead and submit your application. You don't have to wait till the end of the covered period. If you do utilize the 24-week, if you're good in the 8-week and you choose to use the 24, is there additional risk where something could happen to your FTEs? Is there uncertainty for your business if you draw it out over 24 weeks versus using the 8? And then my favorite one right here is, simply ready for the process to be over. I think a lot of organizations are in this boat. They're tired, they're done. Whoever's in charge of tracking this information is probably pretty done with the words PPP loan. And they might just want to say, okay, we've expended everything, let's just apply for forgiveness. So in retrospect, or in comparison, why would a borrower choose to use the 24-week covered period? So this is where we have an organization that hasn't expended all the funds and there's still funds left. This could be from a miscalculation of the original PPP loan amount. This could be due to just changes in the business that were unexpected. And second bullet here, this is where originally there was kind of thought that maybe the FTs were going to be based upon a 30-hour period, and now we need to bump everyone up to 40, or we need an extended period of time to get our FTEs restored. These are all kind of good considerations for possibly using this 24-week covered period. So if you do choose to utilize the 24-week covered period, one major factor to consider is the additional documentation required. So when you go in and you're calculating loan forgiveness and you're compiling everything you need, there's a lot of documentation that needs to be tracked. So your organization has to track payroll, payroll expenditures, track everything by employee for FTE calculations, And you're going to have to go in and look at those non-payroll costs. So your rent, your mortgage interest, your utilities. Over an 8-week period, I think that's already daunting for a lot of people. Pushing it out over 24 weeks and calculating your weekly average FTEs for, say 100 employees over 24 weeks, it's a daunting task for a lot of organizations. So, that is a consideration, and many organizations need to be prepared to retain and submit this documentation, not only for 8 weeks, but for 24, if they do choose to push out to that longer period of time, or if they're required to, because it's a newer loan that's obtained after June 5th. So we've got a note here, and it indicates forgivable expenses remain non-deductible. So, that really relates to for-profit businesses. But, we do have that question on, well, how do I account for things on my Form 990, or how is this going to be reported on my tax return? And even though I work primarily tax, this question kind of comes in a lot, and I'm like, this is an audit question. But what we do know is, when we have the loan, it has to be reported on our financial statements for audit purposes as a loan or a liability until we obtain formal forgiveness. So we've got organizations here, that are going to come up to a June 30th year end. It's going to be reported as a loan. If during the audit later in the year it's converted, that would be a note into the financial statements for a subsequent event. But eventually, once we obtain that formal loan forgiveness, then we would see the conversion of the forgiven portion from that loan or liability into the grant. But at this time, we don't have any formal guidance that's been released to help our audit teams out, or to really tell us how we need to report even the expenditures that go out for payroll. How do we report this on our financial statements? What does it look like? So we're assuming more guidance will be issued in relation to those pieces. And this kind of example of just, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a quick question here. Can we use, say, 10 weeks out of the 24 and then submit the loan forgiveness application?
So right now, we have not seen official guidance that indicates that you can use kind of a loan period different from 24 or 8. It could be coming. We could see additional guidance that clarifies that piece. But as of right now, the way that the loan forgiveness application is written, it gives you the option of 24, or you can elect the shorter 8-week covered period for existing borrowers. So it's something that could be in the works to change it so that you've got an option to, say, use 10 weeks instead of 24, but right now there's not formal guidance to indicate that piece. So that's a good question. We do know that you can submit the application prior to the 24-week period if you elect to use the 8-week covered period. So if you elect to use 8-week, you do not need to wait. You can go ahead, and once your 8-week or that covered period you've selected has ended, you can go ahead and submit your application. And that's kind of where we were working with this example right here. You can see that the process is going to be delayed. And that's where it gets a little bit tricky with the year ends for organizations. If you push that loan out or utilize the 24-week covered period, this example is a loan originating in April 10th. You wouldn't even be done with that 24-week period until September. By the time an organization submits the application, you've got 10 months technically to get that loan forgiveness application in. And then even then the bank has 60 days to approve, and then the SBA has 90 days to approve. And we think a lot of organizations are going to have this issue where it's going to roll potentially into next year. But hopefully we'll get some additional guidance soon. But yes, as I mentioned, the current SBA PPP loan forgiveness application indicates the 24-week covered period is automatic, but existing borrowers can elect that 8-week. And that's all we've seen so far. So the new legislation also pushed out the end date. So kind of this June 30th at the end of this month, they've kept it as the last day to obtain that PPP loan number. But now when we're looking at the end of the covered period, instead of it having to fall before June 30th, on or before June 30th, we now have until December 31st. So the covered period for our PPP loan has to end on or before December 31st. And in addition, December 31st is going to be our new date for ensuring that, or giving the safe harbor for our FTEs and getting people back onto the payroll. So the new legislation, this is kind of the big one that has been the main topic of discussion, is this new 60% payroll requirement. So the original guidance told us that 75% or more of the PPP funds that were received needed to be used for payroll, for eligible payroll expenditures. So they moved that down. So now you're required to spend 60% or more on eligible payroll costs. And then that gives you 40% or less on the new payroll expenditures. It was not a cliff rule prior to the new guidance and legislation on June 5th. It is still not a cliff rule. So what that means is if you drop below this 60%, you can still apply and obtain partial loan forgiveness. And so this is our example. Previously, if you borrowed $100,000 and you spent $60K on payroll, you would have been eligible for $80,000 in loan forgiveness. And then with the new legislation, it came out and told us we needed to use 60% or more of the covered loan amount for payroll costs. And then when we look at our example, still not a cliff rule, but now if we have that same loan amount of $100,000, we spend $60,000 on our eligible payroll expenditures, 40% on the non-payroll eligible expenditures. Now you can get maximum forgiveness of $100,000. You can get full loan forgiveness. So the intent here was to help the borrowers, to make this a little bit more lenient, to help more organizations obtain the maximum loan forgiveness and allow them to get 100% loan forgiveness by reducing this. So the new legislation also kind of updated some of the FTE rules. So originally, when we have our PPP loan, it indicated that our forgiveness, or the amount that we can have forgiven of our PPP loan, is going to be affected if an employer or an organization does not maintain the FTE, or the full-time equivalent count for employees during the covered period, as compared to several reference periods. So those reference periods are January 1st, 2020 through February 29th, 2020, and then from last year, February 15th, 2019 through June 30th, 2019. Those were our two reference periods. The new legislation has not updated those. Will we see additional guidance? It's possible, but as of right now, those are still our reference periods for FTEs. Seasonal employers are allowed to choose a different reference period that covers 12 consecutive weeks, so that they can have kind of an FTE comparison period that's more in line with the seasonality of their business. So following the guidance coming out, additional interim guidance was released to give us some exceptions and safe harbors, because essentially employers came back and they said, this isn't fair. Due to COVID-19, there's no way that we've been able to maintain our FTEs. And they're saying, well, what happens about this? You know, what if someone retires? Am I now going to be docked or have my PPP loan reduced because someone retired at my company? That's not fair. So they did come out with some of these existing exceptions. So these are still in place. They were just in place before the new legislation on June 5th. So the first one here is your FTE. It will not be reduced if the organization made a good faith written offer to rehire an employee during the covered period. So if you furloughed somebody, you made them a good faith written offer and they declined you because they were making more on unemployment for some reason, or they had some other reason that they refused to come back to your business, the organization would not be hurt from an FTE standpoint if you made that offer to rehire in good faith. Existing exception number 2, if you fired an employee, if someone voluntarily resigned, if they retired, or in the case that you had somebody who, say is normally a full-time employee and then due to COVID, they decided, hey, I need to stay home more, or I can't work full-time because of the schedules with my children or something like that, and they voluntarily requested a reduction in hours, the organization's not going to be harmed by that reduction in the FTE. You should document it. Your organization should have these documented, but the organization should not be penalized for these circumstances. And then the existing safe harbor essentially said, if we go back and we look at this time period, February 15th, before everything happened kind of with the coronavirus, what was your FTE level? If you can get back up to that FTE level by June 30th originally, now December 31st, the organization again will not be penalized. And then I put a note down here because they did extend that out. So instead of June 30th, we're now looking at December 31st. Well, what about those organizations that want to submit their application? So it's either December 31st or it's the date in which your loan forgiveness application is submitted. So if you submit your application before December 31st, you would have needed to reinstate or get that FTE level up by that date that you put in your application for the loan forgiveness submission. So the new legislation on June 5th added a couple additional exemptions for the FTE rules. And they essentially said, if you can come in and show either this inability to rehire individuals, or you cannot fill these positions, you can exempt this piece. And then B here, this is the big one that we think is going to come into play for quite a few organizations. And this is where essentially you come in and say, I couldn't reinstate or get back up to these FTE levels due to a federal mandate. So this is Health and Human Services, the CDC, OSHA. If one of these rules prevents you from bringing on your employees or getting back up to where you should be operationally, you will not be penalized on that FTE piece. However, you do need to document that piece. I think where this is going to come into play is where organizations have employees and all of a sudden you can't have as many employees, or you've got a restriction on part of your operations due to, say, the 6-foot rule, or not allowing employees to interact with someone who's come into your nonprofit for one reason or another. And it's affected the number of people that you can have employed or the number of people you can have on a staff or a shift at one time. This is where you'd want to document that compliance with these federal regulations. And did we have a question come in, Evan?
Yes.
Okay.
Do you know how the extension of the PPP will affect our ability to draw EPSL or EFMLA?
So right now, I don't think that it should affect that. I do know right now that like with the expanded FFMLA, or where you have received any other credits that are kind of related to the CARES Act, you can't have those pieces kind of overlap. So if you're paying someone for expanded FFMLA, and you've got that payroll cost going out, you can't take those funds and kind of also submit them under the PPP loan rules, but they haven't released anything new other than that initial interim guidance that states that those costs cannot overlap. But I haven't seen anything else new, and you can always email that question directly to me, and I can see if anyone else, you know, in the firm has a better answer. So this next slide kind of covers, with the new legislation, the extension of the deferral period. So originally, we knew that the deferral payment for principal and interest, it was going to be no less than 6 months and no more than a year when this would come into play. And our new legislation just kind of opens it up and says until the date on which the amount of forgiveness is determined under section 1106, and it's remitted to the lender. And I think, you know, they put this, and it's very open here, and I think it's because we just don't really understand at this point how long it's going to take for a lot of these applications to make it through the process. I don't think there's a good understanding right now of how long it's going to take people to apply for forgiveness, to get it submitted and approved with their lender, and then for the lender to get this moved through with the SBA. So that's why I think they took off that no more than a year, because I think they're starting to anticipate that this process is going to drag out for a while, and they don't want this principal and interest essentially coming due on organizations that are still in this process of obtaining the forgiveness with the lender and the SBA. The last note on here, this kind of reverts back to when I mentioned previously, a borrower has 10 months essentially to get their loan forgiveness application for the PPP loan program in. So if you fail to apply after 10 months, the interest payments are going to start rolling. So you've got 10 months from the end of your covered period to get that PPP loan forgiveness application in. I think most people will be kind of chomping at the bit to get this done, so I don't expect that this will be an issue. So this piece, extension of the loan maturity, this is one of those items that's not retroactive. So this does have that June 5th date. So the original legislation essentially said that if you need to pay back your loan, if you're not entitled to 100% loan forgiveness and you've got a portion that's paid back, you've got 2 years to do it. 2 years, 1%. The new legislation indicates that anyone who received a loan after June 5th now has a maturity date of 5 years for the loan repayment. However, a borrower that received the loan before June 5th can renegotiate these terms with their lender to get up to the 5 years for the loan maturity date as needed. I thought it was kind of interesting that they did it, that new loans get 5 years and previous loans get 2, but I don't make the rules. So, but you can obtain 5 years if you need it, and that would be something to take up with the lender. So this last piece, this one was kind of interesting. So payroll tax deferral, essentially the CARES Act allowed employers to defer their share of 2020 payroll taxes for 2 years. So you could pay it back in 50% in 2021, 50% in 2022, instead of paying it right now in 2020 when it's due. So our original legislation said if you received a PPP loan, you cannot do this once you get your PPP loan, essentially. And now they've opened it up with the new legislation, and it allows a borrower with a PPP loan to defer those payroll taxes both before and after the loan forgiveness date. So essentially, PPP loan borrowers are now allowed to use the payroll tax deferral just like any other organization that was utilizing this payroll tax deferral kind of credit piece. So now that we've moved through kind of the new legislation, I think it's given us a good background for what's changed, the 8-week versus 24-week. what can my organization do to maximize PPP loan forgiveness? And I think this is where I spend a lot of time with clients, with other people within Eide Bailly, just kind of going through what are kind of these broad categories. So when we talk about PPP loan forgiveness, we need the organization to kind of fit into 3 buckets, and you have to meet all 3 for 100% loan forgiveness. So the first one is to make sure that the organization uses the proceeds of the PPP loan for eligible expenditures. So eligible payroll costs, 60% or more must be for eligible payroll. 40% or less is for the mortgage interest, the rent, and the utilities. So that's kind of element 1. You have to meet that. Element 2 is the organization has to maintain the FTE, full-time equivalent employees. And the third factor you have to meet is you have to maintain the employee salary levels. That's either annual or hourly. So an organization has to do all 3 of these things to maximize loan forgiveness. So in other words, if one of these does not occur, it's going to impact some part of your loan forgiveness amount. So say you utilize all of your proceeds perfectly, say 100% goes to payroll. Well, all of a sudden, if we don't have that maintenance of FTEs or we don't have maintenance of salaries, even though it's all been spent appropriately, there still may be a reduction in the PPP loan amount that's forgiven. And do we have another question, Evan, that I can help answer? Okay. We'll keep going then. So, all right, so when we talk about eligible expenditures, payroll is one piece, non-payroll expenditures is the second. And payroll is kind of further broken down. So when we look at payroll, we're looking at 2 different categories. So we're looking at kind of that cash compensation piece that has that 100,000 cap limitation for annualized payroll. And then we've got non-cash payroll pieces, and those are eligible whether or not the employee makes over $100,000 a year. So the first couple bullets, the salary, wages, commissions, cash tips, payments for vacation or leave, and allowance for separation or dismissal. Those are our cash wages, kind of general categories. You know, you can't have more than $100,000, or if you're doing 8 weeks, $15,385 over your 8-week period. You've got limits on those amounts. In addition to those, you can pay whatever you would like with your PPP loan for these non-cash payroll, and that's those payments for the employee benefits, that's your healthcare coverage, your insurance premiums, your retirement, and also state and local taxes. So remember, it's that employer portion of state and local taxes. It's your employer portion that you have paid. The employee portion is not eligible, and also that federal portion of income taxes is also not eligible. So we can't pick up federal income tax. You cannot include FICA. Those types of expenditures are not eligible. It's just that state and local income tax piece. For non-payroll, it's mortgage interest payments, it's your rent payments, your rent or your lease, and your utilities. We received some interim guidance. I don't even know when it was now, maybe a couple weeks. And originally, kind of that initial guidance indicated that the rent or the lease and the mortgage had to be on real property. They expanded it so that it covers personal property as well. And where that gives us a little bit more freedom on these 40% of non-payroll expenditures that are allowable for the PPP loan funds is, you know, do you have office equipment that you're leasing? Do you have vehicles that you're leasing? You know, some organizations have these personal property pieces that are associated with lease payments. As long as they were in place before 2/15/2020, you can now pick up some of those expenditures. So it's not just for the real property, you can include it for the personal property as well. Utility payments is one of those places where we still get a lot of questions, but there's just not good guidance. And given the fact that they've kind of expanded the amount for payroll, or they've kind of reduced that down to 60 and allowed you more non-payroll, I don't know if we'll see more guidance on utility payments, but they've pretty much just told us telephone, internet, gas, sewer, electricity, those are the basic categories they've given us. I know we've had a lot of questions about cell phones. Does it fit in telephone? I think there's an argument that could be made for it, but the organizations will have to go in and determine, what falls under these utility payments. I don't think they're going to give us anything specific that starts to list out kind of those individual utility pieces. They did add transportation into utility payments. So for the most part, there's kind of that general guidance that indicates that like gasoline or fuel costs for like fleet vehicles and things like that could be under utility, but otherwise, they just haven't given us much kind of meat or really good details on some of these non-payroll pieces. They've just given us these broad categories. A common question that comes up is really understanding this piece on kind of paid and incurred. And so the guidance indicates, and this is directly from the instructions for the PPP loan forgiveness application, and it indicates that, our borrowers are eligible for forgiveness for payroll costs paid and payroll costs incurred either during their 24-week covered period or 8-week covered period. And so I think this is where a lot of people want to double check and they're saying, is this okay to do? But this is where we're seeing, say you get your PPP loan disbursement on June 1st and your company turns around and makes a regularly scheduled payroll on June 2nd. Is that eligible? And the answer is yes. It's a payroll cost paid that was paid out during your covered period. So even though that payroll payment was technically probably for wages or for your employee's payroll for the month of May, it still counts because it was paid during your covered period. Same thing when we get to the end. It allows you to take whatever is incurred through the very end date. So those couple days leading up to your 168-day period for 24 weeks or your 56-day period for your 8-week, you can include those payroll costs that are incurred all the way up to that end date, so long as they are paid by the next regularly scheduled payroll disbursement date that is directly after the end of the covered period. So you can do that for payroll. And I believe the interim guidance gives you a similar example for, I think it's maybe rent. For those non-payroll costs. So they say, hey, yep, you got your loan June 1st and you paid May's rent on a monthly basis, you paid it in June. You get to pick it up, include it as part of your PPP costs, even though it was May's rent, you paid it in June. Same thing, if you're doing 8 weeks, you'd have your rent for June and July, but your covered period would end, but that July rent is paid in August. You get to pick it up as long as it's the next regularly scheduled pay date for that expenditure. So there's a little bit of flexibility, within the PPP loan guidance for organizations to potentially pick up kind of one extra payment that we've been seeing. So that kind of covered our first piece, where you want to make sure you spend your PPP funds appropriately on eligible expenditures. The second piece is maintaining your FTEs. And this is where you want to make sure you stay at those FTE levels, and they allow you 2 ways to calculate. So your calculations based on a 40-hour work week. Employees that work 40 or more hours are always counted as one FTE. Doesn't matter if they work 60 or 70 or 45 hours, 1 FTE. Anyone less than, if you're doing the full calculation, 30 hours over 40, that would be 0.75 FTEs, or you can use the simplified method where anybody less than 40 hours a week is 0.5. I would suggest that organizations that have employees that kind of bounce around and have different hours or different schedules, calculating using the full method and the simplified, it might be beneficial to do it both ways, even though it's more work, to make sure that you get the best comparison number for the maintenance of FTEs. And we kind of already covered some of these safe harbor considerations and exceptions when we went through the new rules. And so the last piece is maintenance of salaries. That's kind of our third trigger. So far, I have not talked to any organizations that have reduced their salaries. So I think this is usually a shoe-in item. Most organizations have not reduced their employees' average annual salary. They've not reduced the hourly rate. So as long as that has not occurred, and as long as it doesn't dip below 75% of what they would normally have received pre-COVID-19, that piece should be okay for most organizations. So then kind of just to wrap up, the loan forgiveness application was released. So new copy out this week. Let's see, the 16th was that Tuesday, I think I found it floating out there. So it's the form 3508, that's the full application. 3508EZ is a streamlined application. They are available, and they give you the two options, the 8-week covered period for existing borrowers, or the 24-week, which is kind of the automatic. And that easy application can be utilized by nonprofit organizations. It's really where you meet easily all tests. So if you expended all your funds, if you know that your FTEs have not changed, if you have 10 employees and you still have 10 employees, you'd be eligible, and the maintenance of salaries. So I think a lot of smaller organizations that utilize the funds for payroll still have the same number of employees, didn't touch the compensation paid to their employees, but maintained everything, are going to be eligible potentially for this streamlined application, the 3508EC. And the lenders will have these. So some lenders are already starting to send out the application copies to the borrowers that they're working with. You can find these application copies out right now on the SBA website. And then if you haven't received it already and you'd like a copy, I would recommend reaching out to your lender to have them forward you kind of everything for moving this application forward, because it is out there. Last item really is documentation, just making sure that you have everything for the payroll and for the costs, and for all the reporting for FTEs. You know, even though the SBA has indicated and the Treasury that there's a safe harbor, so those loans less than $2 million, they essentially came out, said safe harbor. You don't have to essentially prove, you know, the necessity of the loan. When you read the SBA's instructions for the loan application, it indicates that everybody has to have all of the paperwork and all of the information for a 6-year retention period. It's just good practice to have all of your documents in order, and even if you have a loan of less than $2 million, to still have the documents that show that your loan was ordinary and necessary and made in good faith in case the SBA ever came in and did take a look at your paperwork. For those with loans over $2 million, it's a requirement to have those documents on file. So I think we're pretty much at the end here, and this is one of our last slides, but it's really just indicating that, you know, this guidance has changed over the last 3 months so quickly that, you know, there's really no surprises when the SBA or the Treasury come out and, you know, release additional questions, give us some additional insights, and but hopefully, you know, everything that we've seen with this last round with the applications should allow most people to start applying. So say thank you for attending, and you know, Eide-Bailly has a website with lots of information about PPP loans. We've got insights, we've got presentations that are recorded webinars that are really informative. And then if you have questions and you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to answer questions that you have. If you need more information on something in the presentation today, I'm happy to look into those for you. And you can definitely send them to me or send them over to Evan. And thank you.
Thank you, Christine. We really appreciate your time and your knowledge and all the information that was given through this. I think that helps a lot of people put their mind at ease and kind of know where to start and what to do. So we appreciate that. And I will follow up with all of you attendees with the recording from the session, also with a link to Christine's email if you're interested in learning more about Bailey or if you have any follow-up questions. But thank you again for your time. We appreciate it. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.